I feel sorry for her and her family and all the kids who knew her around here, just everyone who's felt this loss. All children are sacred to everyone in this world, and for a mother for a mother to do this to a child, she doesn't deserve to be called a mom. She's a monster. I can't imagine anybody, let alone a mother, letting this happen.
She deserves a lot more than this, but this is all our little community can do for her.
She was 3 years old. Her name was Kaylee. And for 5 days after her death, her body lay frozen while the world outside moved on. People went to work, laughed, watched TV, slept. But behind one apartment door in Napa, California, the truth was quietly rotting. A truth so ugly, so disturbing, that even the detectives who opened that door would never forget what they saw. This isn't just a story about child abuse. It's a story about betrayal. Layers of it. From the woman who gave birth to Kaylee. From the man she invited into their lives. From the neighbors who heard the screams. And from the very people who were supposed to protect her. The police, child welfare, social workers. They saw her. They were warned. And they walked away. How does that happen? How does a child like Kaylee, visible, reachable, begging to be saved, get snuffed out so quietly that nobody noticed until it was far too late? I can't stop thinking about her eyes. They were wide, curious, trusting, the kind of eyes only a child can have. The kind that haven't learned what fear is, not yet. But Kaylee Slusher would learn. And by the time her tiny body was discovered, cold, bruised, and stiff in her own mother's bed, those eyes had seen more horror than most of us will in a lifetime. Because this story isn't just a tragedy. It's an indictment. And as you watch, I want you to ask yourself, what do we do when the people who are supposed to protect children become their biggest danger? And maybe even harder to ask, what happens when the system that should save them turns its back? Because in this case, they all did. Every last one of them. If you're watching this and you haven't subscribed yet, ask yourself why. Because every time a story like this fades into silence, it happens again. If you don't want to be part of that silence, hit subscribe now. And if you won't, leave a comment. Tell us why you're okay walking away. She was born in 2010 to Sarah Kruger and Jason Slusher. A sweet baby girl, with Jason holding her like she was made of glass. He loved her. And at first, so did Sarah. At least, that's what everyone wanted to believe. They lived in Napa, California. A town known more for wine tasting and scenic drives than for violent crime. People there didn't lock their doors. The streets were quiet. Safe, they thought. But under the surface of this postcard-perfect town, something was rotting. Kaylee smiled like she didn't know the world could be cruel. That kind of smile, big, wild, unfiltered, only belongs to kids who haven't yet learned to be afraid. And Kaylee Slusher smiled all the time. Her grandparents say she loved bubbles. They'd blow them for her in the backyard, and she'd chase them on tiptoes, laughing so hard she'd fall over. She was fascinated with butterflies. Purple was her favorite color. She called dogs woofies and thought the moon followed her when she rode in the car at night. Simple things. Beautiful things. She was just a little girl. But behind that smile was a child learning to survive in silence. A child who knew how to comfort herself, how to entertain herself, how to protect herself, because no one else would. After a bitter split, Sarah took custody. Jason was pushed to the sidelines. He says he saw the changes first. Kaylee looked thinner, sadder. She'd flinch when people raised their voices. He noticed bruises. Sarah always had an excuse. She's just clumsy, she'd say. She fell at the park. But something didn't feel right. He tried to get the courts to listen. He filed for visitation, submitted reports, and begged for wellness checks. He was fighting a system that didn't want to hear him. A father with partial custody trying to protect his daughter, while judges, officers, and social workers kept handing her back to her mother. And Sarah wasn't alone anymore. That's when the real danger crept in. A man who would change everything. But at this point in the story, no one knew yet. They still saw Kaylee as a happy child, living with her mom, in a modest apartment not far from downtown. But she was already slipping away. Already starting to draw her smiles with a shaky hand, like a child trying to color sunshine into a storm. And no one stopped to ask the most important question. Have you ever known a child who seemed to be trying to smile through pain? Because Kaylee Slusher smiled, even when she was hurting. even when she knew no one was coming. You always want to believe a mother loves her child, right? That no matter how hard life gets, that maternal instinct, the one we all talk about like it's unbreakable, will kick in. But sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's broken. Sometimes it gets swallowed whole by addiction, desperation, and the wrong kind of love. Sarah Kruger was 23 when she had Kaylee. At first, it looked like she was trying, working odd jobs, bouncing between roommates, chasing stability. But even then, there were cracks. Family described her as erratic. She'd disappear for days, then show up out of nowhere, euphoric or weeping. There were rumors about pills, about boyfriends, about rage. By the time Kaylee was 2, Sarah was spiraling. And then she met Ryan Warner. She met him at a friend's house. Just one of those nights. People hanging out, some drinking, others using. He had a tattoo crawling up his neck, a record trailing behind him like a shadow, multiple arrests for assault, drug charges, even rumors of domestic violence that never made it to court. Ryan was charming, in a way predators often are. He said the right things. He acted like he cared. He told Sarah she was special, and she believed him. They were inseparable within weeks. And that's when Kaylee's life began to unravel, fast. Neighbors started to notice loud arguments echoing through the walls at 2 a.m. Sounds of things breaking. Screams. One neighbor, who lived directly below, later testified she often heard a man yelling things like, "Shut her up," and a child crying soon after. Another said she saw Kaylee left alone in the stairwell barefoot, with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders more than once. Inside that apartment, reality was decaying. Methamphetamine use became routine. Sarah and Ryan were often high. They'd lock themselves in the bedroom, leaving Kaylee with crackers and an iPad sometimes for hours. When the drugs wore off, the paranoia would set in. Sarah accused everyone of spying on her. Ryan became violent, not just with Sarah, but with Kaylee too. And no one came to help. Not yet. But the question that haunts me most isn't just about them. It's about why she stayed. Why does someone keep a violent man in their home, next to their child? It's not simple. What we're looking at is trauma bonding, the same psychological mechanism that keeps abuse victims tethered to the very person hurting them. For Sarah, Ryan wasn't just a boyfriend. He became a lifeline, a warped, toxic anchor. And in her eyes, Kaylee wasn't a daughter anymore. She was competition, a threat, an inconvenience, something that stood between her and the only person making her feel wanted, even if that want came with bruises and broken glass. I don't say this to excuse her. I say it to explain what we're about to walk into. Because once Ryan moved in, Kaylee's world, what little safety she had left, was gone. And while neighbors kept hearing, smelling, and feeling that something was wrong, no one intervened. Not the system, not the community, not in time. Should people with a violent criminal history be allowed to live with children? Why or why not? Share your thoughts below. Because sometimes, monsters don't sneak in through the window. They're invited in through the front door. Police officers, child protective services, and caseworkers came 5 times. 5 good times. They all knocked on that door. And every single time, they left. Every knock was a second chance to save her. Every silence, a step closer to her final moments. The first visit came after a neighbor called in a noise complaint. Screaming, glass breaking, what sounded like a child wailing behind thin walls. Officers showed up. Sarah answered the door. She smiled, said it was just a bad day. Kaylee peeked from around the corner. Thin, quiet, eyes too old for her age. The officers left. The second visit came from Kaylee's grandmother. She hadn't been allowed to visit in weeks. She told police she was worried. Something's wrong, she said. Sarah's not okay. Kaylee looks sick. Officers checked in. Sarah said they had the flu. CPS was notified, but nothing came of it. They left again. The third time was different. This time, a neighbor caught a glimpse of Kaylee's back when her shirt lifted. What she saw made her sick. It looked like leopard spots, she said later in court. Purple, black, yellow. She called it in. CPS came. Sarah said Kaylee had fallen down the stairs while playing. They believed her. They didn't examine her. They didn't remove her. They didn't even ask the child if she felt safe. They left. Visit 4 was triggered by a different neighbor. This time, it wasn't just bruises. It was that no one had seen Kaylee for days. No footsteps, no laughter, no giggling on the stairs. Just silence. The officers came back. Sarah was hostile. Told them they were harassing her. said Kaylee was sleeping. They didn't insist. They left. The final visit happened just days before Kaylee died. Her father had called in again, desperate, pleading. Please, he said. Something is going to happen to her. A welfare check was performed. Sarah seemed calm, polite. Ryan hovered in the background. They didn't ask to see Kaylee. They didn't file a report. They didn't come back. That's 5 chances. 5 knock-and-go visits. 5 moments when someone could have stepped in. When someone could have asked just one more question, looked just a little deeper, pushed just a little harder. But they didn't. They left. And each time they did, the space between Kaylee and rescue got smaller, tighter, more suffocating. The bruises got darker. Her ribs got thinner. Her voice got quieter. Until finally, there was nothing left to hear. You just heard 5 chances to save a child wasted. This is why we cover these stories. This is why we don't look away. So if you believe that stories like Kaylee's deserve to be remembered, don't just watch. Subscribe. And if you're choosing not to, explain why. We'll be reading. It was February 1st, 2014. The sun had barely risen in Napa. A tip had come in the night before. Quiet, indirect. A friend of Ryan Warner's had called the police. He said something was wrong. That something had happened to the little girl. That she might be dead. It was vague, but it was enough. Officers knocked again on that familiar door, the same one they'd visited 5 times before. No answer. They forced entry. The apartment was eerily still. No music. No voices. Just a low hum from the refrigerator and the smell, sweet, metallic, unnatural. They walked down the narrow hallway and into the bedroom. That's where they found her. Kaylee was lying on the bed, covered by a stack of blankets. Her arms were stiff. Her legs didn't bend. Her skin was cold, unnaturally cold. One officer later testified he had to leave the room. He said it wasn't just the body. It was the stillness. Like time itself had stopped. They realized almost immediately she had been frozen, stored in the freezer for several days after her death, then moved back into the bed and covered, as if pretending she was still alive would make the truth disappear. Sarah and Ryan were gone. No sign of them in the apartment. No bags packed. No note. Just emptiness. A manhunt began within hours. Photos of Sarah Kruger and Ryan Warner flashed across screens. Helicopters circled. Officers checked bus stops, gas stations, hotels. The search spread from Napa into the Bay Area. People started whispering. How could this happen here? The answer would come quickly. Later that same day, a transit officer spotted them at the El Cerrito del Norte BART station. Sarah and Ryan, calm, holding hands. They didn't run. They didn't struggle. Sarah was even smiling. A strange, vacant kind of smile. They had taken Kaylee's life, and then tried to slip into the crowd, as if they could just vanish. But the story was already out. The world had already heard. And the world was furious. At that moment, Kaylee's face was everywhere, on the news, on posters, in the hands of people sobbing on courthouse steps. And the question spread like wildfire. How did it get this far? How many chances were missed? And now, what would justice even look like? In the days after Kaylee Slusher's death, something changed. The quiet streets weren't so quiet anymore. You could hear it. The grief, the disbelief, the anger, echoing through neighborhoods like an aftershock. People began to gather. Mothers, fathers, grandparents, teachers. They stood shoulder to shoulder, clutching candles and posters. Some cried. Others didn't say a word. Purple balloons floated into the sky. Stuffed animals lined the courthouse steps. One sign said, "She was 3. What's your excuse?" The hashtag started to spread, justice for Kaylee. It wasn't just about mourning, it was about fury. How did no one stop this? Why had CPS been to the apartment so many times and left empty-handed? Why didn't the officers check that final bedroom? And why? Why was Kaylee allowed to stay in that home when so many people had raised the alarm? In town halls and on social media, people demanded answers. One woman, a mother of 2, stood at a protest with a sign that said, "If this can happen here, it can happen anywhere." She was right, because that was the twist no one expected. This wasn't a story from a war zone or an overcrowded urban slum. This was a quiet, suburban town with family restaurants and community gardens, and yet a child had been slowly tortured to death, just 2 blocks from a school. The more people learned, the angrier they became. Protests broke out in front of the Napa County Child Welfare Services office. Reporters circled the city hall. Petitions were signed. A memorial fund was started. Thousands of people wrote letters to the governor. Kaylee had become more than a victim. She had become a symbol of every child who slipped through the cracks. In every moment, a system looked away. Every time someone said, "It's not my business," and turned their back. And if this perfect town could bury a child under a smile and a silence, what other towns were doing the same? In 2017, the trials began, separate proceedings for Sarah Kruger and Ryan Warner. Both faced the same 3 charges: first-degree murder, torture, and assault on a child resulting in death. But what unfolded inside those walls wasn't just a legal process. It was a horror story read out loud. The prosecution didn't hold back. They brought photos, medical charts, diagrams of a child's body with red circles around every injury, 41 in total. The worst were internal: a ruptured small intestine, blood pooling in her abdomen, old bruises overlapping new ones, like someone had tried to erase the past by beating it over and over. One pediatric trauma expert testified, "This was not a single moment of violence. This was prolonged. It escalated, and she knew it was coming." Another forensic pathologist said, "She would have been in unimaginable pain, conscious, fully aware, for at least 2 days before death." Sarah sat stone-faced throughout most of it. But Ryan? He smirked. He leaned back, crossed his arms, like he was watching a movie he'd already seen. The prosecutor pointed to that smirk, called it cold indifference, said it was proof of intent. The jury seemed to agree. And then came the moment that no one could stomach. The pathologist described how Kaylee's body had been partially frozen, how she was likely placed in a freezer post-mortem, then laid back in the bed so her killers could stage the scene. It wasn't just murder. It was a cover-up, done with calculation. That's when one juror stood up and asked for a break. In the end, the verdict was unanimous. They were found guilty on all counts. Both Sarah Kruger and Ryan Warner were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. No appeals, no leniency, no second chances. The judge called it one of the most disturbing and tragic cases I've seen in my entire career. And the room went silent again. Not because justice had been done, but because it still didn't feel like enough. Kaylee was gone, and nothing, no sentence, no verdict, no speech, could bring her back. Just when it felt like the story was over, it wasn't. In 2021, 4 years after the sentencing, an appellate court made a decision that sent shockwaves through everyone who'd followed Kaylee's case. A decision that, depending on who you ask, either honored due process or shattered justice all over again. The court overturned the torture enhancement. Their reasoning? There wasn't sufficient proof that Sarah Kruger or Ryan Warner intended to kill Kaylee during the torture. Think about that. A child is beaten. Her organs rupture. She cries for help no one gives. She's locked in a room for days, starving, bleeding, dying. And the court said, yes, this was torture, but we're not sure they meant to kill her. So the punishment changed. Life without parole became 25 years to life. The earliest parole eligibility for Warner is 2029. For Kruger, 2031. The backlash was immediate. People who'd lit candles at her vigil returned to the same courthouse, this time in rage. Parents screamed into microphones. Survivors of childhood abuse shared their stories. Petitioners gathered signatures by the thousands. Even the prosecutor who'd helped win the original convictions issued a public statement, calling the ruling a devastating reversal of the meaning of justice in a child's murder. It forced all of us to ask a question we weren't prepared for. What is intent when the outcome is this brutal? Is it not enough that Kaylee suffered? Is it not enough that they ignored her cries? That they locked the door and let her die? Does a murderer deserve a lighter sentence just because they didn't say the words out loud? Do you agree with the court's decision? Should the lack of intent reduce punishment when a child is tortured to death? Let us know in the comments. Because that ruling didn't just reopen a case. It reopened a wound. The people who tortured Kaylee could be out in a few years. Let that sink in. If that doesn't scare you into caring, nothing will. Hit subscribe so stories like this don't vanish into legal technicalities. And if you're not going to, drop your reason in the comments. The rest of us deserve to hear it. After the verdicts were read, after the sentences were handed down, after the appeals court tore open old wounds, there was one fight left, and it came from the people who had loved Kaylee most. Her father, her grandparents. They weren't just grieving. They were angry, and they wanted answers, not from her killers this time, but from the system that let it happen. In 2015, they filed a civil lawsuit against the city of Napa and Napa County. The allegations were damning, that police officers, child protective services, and caseworkers had been warned repeatedly, that they'd seen the bruises, heard the screams, witnessed the signs, and chose not to act. One of the most haunting claims in the case? That Kaylee could have been saved if just one person had done their job. The case dragged on for years. Depositions, motions, delays. But in 2019, the city and county agreed to settle. The family received $5 million, a number that, frankly, feels meaningless when you think about what was lost. But what mattered more were the reforms. As part of the settlement, Napa officials agreed to change how they handle child welfare calls. Officers would now undergo specialized training to recognize abuse signs. CPS workers would be retrained on mandatory follow-ups, and flagged homes, like the one Kaylee lived in, would receive multiple agency oversight. It wasn't justice, but it was a start. It was a way to say, never again. Her father, Jason, spoke publicly only once after the settlement. He said, "There's not a day I don't think about her. But if something good can come from this, if even one child gets saved because someone paid closer attention, then at least she didn't die for nothing." This case didn't end in a courtroom. It ended in policy, in prevention, in the hope that someone, somewhere, will knock a little louder, ask a second question, refuse to walk away. Because now, there's no excuse. They all know Kaylee's name. It's been over a decade since Kaylee Slusher died. And yet, in some ways, the story never ended. The people involved are still out there, some locked away, others trying to rebuild. And the system that failed her is still trying to prove it learned something from its own failure. Sarah Kruger is incarcerated in the Central California Women's Facility. She will be eligible for parole in 2031. She'll be 45 years old. That's younger than most of the jurors who sentenced her. Younger than some of the officers who walked away from her door. If the board believes she's reformed, if she says the right things, shows the right remorse, she could one day walk free. Ryan Warner is in state prison, too. His parole eligibility date is 2029, just 4 years from now. That's not a lifetime. That's a blink. For someone who ignored Kaylee's pain, mocked her cries, and left her to die, freedom may be just around the corner. And then there's Jason Slusher, Kaylee's father. He never got his little girl back. He never will. But he's tried to make something from the wreckage. He speaks to schools, parent groups, and community organizers. Talks about red flags, custody battles, what it's like to beg for help and be told, "We're doing all we can," until your child ends up in a morgue. He doesn't always get through the speeches. Sometimes he breaks down. Sometimes he leaves early. He's still grieving, still fighting nightmares, still wondering if there was something else he could have done. And what about the system? Since the lawsuit, Napa's police and CPS have changed. Officers now receive mandatory training in child welfare protocol. CPS instituted a dual-check system for at-risk children, meaning no case can be closed without a second supervisor's approval. Community reporting hotlines were expanded. It's not perfect, but it's a beginning. And it's because of Kaylee. Even in death, she changed things. Not just for her family, but for every child after her. The vigil was held under a gray sky. People stood in silence, holding candles that flickered against the cold. Someone laid out her favorite toys: plastic butterflies, a toy pony, a worn-out doll with tangled hair. Someone else brought her favorite snack, chocolate pudding. They handed out purple ribbons. Purple was her favorite color. I remember one woman crying as she tied hers to a street lamp. "I didn't know her," she said, "but I can't stop thinking about her." No one could. Her face is everywhere now. But she should have just been a kid, learning how to write her name, running in the park, making messy art on the living room wall. Instead, her story became a warning, a name held up like a sign. Because Kaylee Slusher didn't die just because of her abusers. She died because of every person and every system that walked away when she needed them most. The neighbor who didn't follow up. The officer who knocked and left. The social worker who closed the file. The judge who didn't ask one more question. Kaylee's story is a tragedy, but it's also a mirror. And the question staring back at us is the one that matters most now. What should change so that no child ever suffers the way Kaylee did? Tell us in the comments. Speak her name. Demand better. Because we owe her that much. We owe her everything. There's no happy ending here. Just a question. Will you remember her or forget her like the rest did? If you believe Kaylee's name matters, subscribe. Don't wait. Don't scroll. And if you can't bring yourself to, at least tell us why below. Maybe someone will change your mind. Thank you for watching, and see you in my next video.